Audible Frontiers presents The Fountains of Paradise, written by Arthur C. Clarke, and narrated by Mark Vitor.
Politics and religion are obsolete. The time has come for science and spirituality. Shri Jawaharlal Nehru. To the Ceylon Association for the Advancement of Science, Colombo, 15th of October, 1962. Introduction. In the 2 decades since the 1978 Sources and Acknowledgements was written, there have been some astonishing developments in this particular field of space engineering. The literature is now so extensive that I can no longer keep up with it. I contributed to it myself at the 30th Congress of the International Astronautical Federation at Munich in 1979. See The Space Elevator, Thought Experiment or Key to the Universe, reprinted in Ascent to Orbit, a Scientific Autobiography, John Wiley & Sons, 1984. Perhaps most amazing is the discovery of the material that will make the elevator possible. As I suggested in this novel, it is indeed carbon, but not, fortunately, diamond. The unexpected and Nobel Prize-winning discovery of the C60 molecule, Buckminster fullerene, has opened up the prospect of materials hundreds of times stronger than steel. Indeed, one of the first statements made by Smalley and Kroto when they discovered this material was that it could be used to make a space elevator. In 1979, I recorded much of the novel on a 12-inch record, Cadman TC 1606. The record sleeve had a long essay about the space elevator, together with a drawing of it reaching from Sri Lanka to geostationary orbit. And by a truly incredible coincidence, these were kindly provided by my old friend Buckminster Fuller. What a tragedy that he never lived to see the discovery of the material bearing his name. The space elevator does indeed seem to be an idea whose time has almost come. At a recent workshop at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, NASA engineers concluded that this is no longer science fiction. For details, explore their website, www.nasa.gov. And that was science fiction when I wrote the novel. One of my most valued possessions is a photograph taken aboard the Space Shuttle Atlantis during the first mission, STS-75, to lower a payload on a tether, one small step toward the space elevator. It shows astronaut Jeffrey Hoffman with a copy of this book floating in space beside him. When they returned to Earth, the shuttle crew autographed it and mailed it to me. Finally, I'd like to record that I had the great pleasure of meeting the charming inventor of the space elevator, Yuri Artsutanov, in Leningrad during my visit to Russia in 1982. See my collection of essays, 1984, Spring a Choice of Futures. And I am glad that Yuri has now received recognition for his brilliant and daring concept. Colombo, Sri Lanka, 21st of September, 2000. Preface. From Paradise to Taprobany is 40 leagues. There may be heard the sound of the fountains of paradise. Traditional, reported by Friar Marignoli, A.D. 1335. The country I have called Taprobany does not quite exist, but is about 90% congruent with the island of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Though the sources and acknowledgements will make clear what locations, events, and personalities are based on fact, the listener will not go far wrong in assuming that the more unlikely the story, the closer it is to reality. The name Taprobane is now usually spoken to rhyme with plain, but the correct classical pronunciation is Taprobany, as Milton, of course, in Paradise Regained, Book 4, well knew. From India and the golden Chersones and utmost Indian isle Taprobani. Part 1. The Palace. 1. Kalidasa. The crown grew heavier with each passing year. When the venerable Bodhidharma Mahanayake Thero had, so reluctantly, first placed it upon his head, Prince Kalidasa was surprised by its lightness. Now, 20 years later, King Kalidasa gladly relinquished the jewel-encrusted band of gold whenever court etiquette allowed. There was little of that here, upon the wind-swept summit of the rock fortress. Few envoys or petitioners sought audience on its forbidding heights. Many of those who made the journey to Yakagala turned back at the final ascent, through the very jaws of the crouching lion that seemed always about to spring from the face of the rock. An old king could never sit upon this heaven-aspiring throne. One day Kalidasa would be too feeble to reach his own palace, but he doubted if that day would ever come. His many enemies would spare him the humiliations of age. Those enemies were gathering now. He glanced toward the north, as if he could already see the armies of his half-brother, returning to claim the blood-stained throne of Taprobani. But that threat was still far off, across monsoon-riven seas. Although Kalidasa put more trust in his spies than in his astrologers, it was comforting to know that they agreed on this. Malgara, making plans and gathering the support of foreign kings, had waited almost 20 years. A yet more patient and subtle enemy lay much nearer at hand, forever watching from the southern sky. The perfect cone of Sri Khanda, the sacred mountain, looked very close today as it towered above the central plain. Since the beginning of history it had struck awe into the heart of every man who saw it. Always Kalidasa was aware of its brooding presence and the power that it symbolized. And yet the Mahanayake Thero had no armies, no screaming war elephants tossing brazen tusks as they charged into battle. The high priest was only an old man in an orange robe, whose sole material possessions were a begging bowl and a palm leaf to shield him from the sun. While the lesser monks and acolytes chanted the scriptures around him, he merely sat in cross-legged silence, and somehow tampered with the destinies of kings. It was very strange. The air was so clear today that Kalidasa could see the temple, dwarfed by distance to a tiny white arrowhead on the very summit of Sri Khanda. It did not look like any work of man, and it reminded the king of the still greater mountains he had glimpsed in his youth, when he had been half guest, half hostage at the court of Mahinda the Great. All the giants that guarded Mahinda's empire bore such crowns, formed of a dazzling crystalline substance for which there was no word in the language of Taprobani. The Hindus believed that it was a kind of water, magically transformed, but Kalidasa laughed at such superstitions. That ivory gleam was only 3 days' march away. 1 along the royal road, through forests and paddy fields, 2 more up the winding stairway that he could never climb again, because at its end was the only enemy he feared and could not conquer. Sometimes he envied the pilgrims when he saw their torches marking a thin line of fire up the face of the mountain. The humblest beggar could greet that holy dawn and receive the blessings of the gods. The ruler of all this land could not. But he had his consolations, if only for a little while. Guarded by moat and rampart lay the pools and fountains and pleasure gardens on which he had lavished the wealth of his kingdom. And when he was tired of these, there were the ladies of the rock, the ones of flesh and blood, whom he summoned less and less frequently, and the 200 changeless immortals, with whom he often shared his thoughts, because there were no others he could trust. Thunder boomed along the western sky. Kalidasa turned away from the brooding menace of the mountain toward the distant hope of rain. The monsoon was late this season. The artificial lakes that fed the island's complex irrigation system were almost empty. By this time of year he should have seen the glint of water in the mightiest of them all, which, as he well knew, his subjects still dared to call by his father's name, Paravana Samudra, the Sea of Paravana. It had been completed only 30 years ago, after generations of toil. In happier days, young Prince Kalidasa had stood proudly beside his father when the great sluice gates were opened and the life-giving waters had poured out across the thirsty land. In all the kingdom there was no lovelier sight than the gently rippling mirror of that immense man-made lake when it reflected the domes and spires of Ranapura, city of gold, the ancient capital which he had abandoned for his dream. Once more the thunder rolled, but Kalidasa knew that its promise was false. Even here on the summit of Demon Rock the air hung still and lifeless. There were none of the sudden random gusts that heralded the onset of the monsoon. Before the rains came at last, famine might be added to his troubles. "Majesty," said the patient voice of the chamberlain, "the envoys are about to leave. They wish to pay their respects." Ah, yes, those two pale ambassadors from across the Western Ocean. He would be sorry to see them go, for they had brought news, in their abominable taprobany, of many wonders, though none, they were willing to admit, that equaled this fortress palace in the sky. Kalidasa turned his back upon the white-capped mountain and the parched, shimmering landscape, and began to descend the granite steps to the audience chamber. Behind him, the chamberlain and his aides bore gifts of ivory and gems for the tall, proud men who were waiting to say farewell. Soon they would carry the treasures of Taprobani across the sea, to a city younger by centuries than Ranapura, and perhaps, for a little while, divert the brooding thoughts of the Emperor Hadrian. His robes a flare of orange against the white plaster of the temple walls, the Mahanayaki Thero walked slowly to the northern parapet. Far below lay the checkerboard of paddy fields stretching from horizon to horizon, the dark lines of irrigation channels, the blue gleam of the Paravana Samudra, and, beyond that inland sea, the sacred domes of Ranapura, floating like ghostly bubbles, impossibly huge when one realized their true distance. For 30 years he had watched that ever-changing panorama, but he knew that he would never grasp all the details of its fleeting complexity. Colors, boundaries altered with every season, indeed with every passing cloud. On the day that he too passed, thought Bodhidharma, he would still see something new. Only one thing jarred in all this exquisitely patterned landscape. Tiny though it appeared from this altitude, the gray boulder of Demon Rock seemed an alien intruder. Legend had it that Yakagala was a fragment of the herb-bearing Himalayan peak that the monkey god Hanuman had dropped as he hastily carried both medicine and mountain to his injured comrades when the battles of the Ramayana were over. From this distance it was impossible, of course, to see any details of Kalidasa's folly, except for a faint line that hinted at the outer rampart of the pleasure gardens. Yet once it had been experienced, such was the impact of Demon Rock that it was impossible to forget it. The Mahanayake Thero could see in imagination, as clearly as if he stood between them, the immense lion's claws protruding from the sheer face of the cliff, while overhead loomed the battlements upon which, it was easy to believe, the accursed king still walked. Thunder crashed down from above, rising swiftly to such a crescendo of power that it seemed to shake the mountain itself. In a continuous, sustained concussion it raced across the sky, dwindling away into the east. For long seconds echoes rolled around the rim of the horizon. No one could mistake this as any herald of the coming rains. They were not scheduled for another 3 weeks, and monsoon control was never in error by more than 24 hours. When the reverberations had died away, the high priest turned to his companion. "So much for designated re-entry corridors," he said, with slightly more annoyance than an exponent of the Dharma should permit himself. "Did we get a meter reading?" The younger monk spoke briefly into his wrist microphone and waited for a reply. "Yes, it peaked at 120. That's 5 decibels above the previous record." "Send the usual protest to Kennedy or Gagarin Control, whichever it is. On second thought, complain to them both. Not that it will make any difference, of course." As his eye traced the slowly dissolving vapor trail across the sky, the venerable Bodhidharma Mahanayake Thero, 85th of his name, had a sudden and most unmonkish fantasy. Kalidasa would have had a suitable treatment for space line operators who thought only of dollars per kilo to orbit, something that probably involved impalement or metal-shod elephants or boiling oil. But life, of course, had been so much simpler 2,000 years ago. 2. The Engineer. His friends, whose numbers sadly dwindled every year, called him Johann. The world, when it remembered him, called him Raja. His full name epitomized 500 years of history: Johann Oliver de Alwis Sri Raja Singh. There had been a time when the tourists visiting Demon Rock had sought him out with cameras and recorders, but now a whole generation knew nothing of the days when his was the most familiar face in the solar system. He did not regret his past glory, for it had brought him the gratitude of all mankind, but it had also brought vain regrets for the mistakes he had made, and sorrow for the lives he had squandered, when a little more foresight or patience might have saved them. It was easy now, with the perspective of history, to see what should have been done to avert the Auckland crisis, or to assemble the unwilling signatories of the Treaty of Samarkand. To blame himself for the unavoidable errors of the past was folly, yet there were times when his conscience hurt him more than the fading twinges of that old Patagonian bullet. No one had believed that his retirement would last so long. "You'll be back within 6 months," World President Chu had told him. "Power is addictive." "Not to me," he had answered, truthfully enough. For power had come to him. He had never sought it, and it had always been a special, limited kind of power, advisory, not executive. He was only special assistant, acting ambassador for political affairs, directly responsible to President and Council, with a staff that never exceeded 10, 11 if one included Aristotle. His own consul still had direct access to Ari's memory and processing banks, and they talked to each other several times a year. But toward the end, the council had invariably accepted his advice, and the world had given him much of the credit that should have gone to the unsung, unhonored bureaucrats of the Peace Division. And so it was Ambassador-at-Large Raja Singh who got all the publicity, as he moved from one trouble spot to another, massaging egos here, diffusing crises there, and manipulating the truth with consummate skill. Never actually lying, of course. That would have been fatal. Without Ari's infallible memory, he could never have kept control of the intricate webs he was sometimes compelled to spin in order that mankind might live in peace. When he had begun to enjoy the game for its own sake, he knew it was time to quit. That had been 20 years ago, and he had never regretted his decision. Those who predicted that boredom would succeed where the temptations of power had failed did not know their man or understand his origins. He had gone back to the fields and forests of his youth, and was living only a kilometre from the great brooding rock that had dominated his childhood. Indeed, his villa was actually inside the wide moat that surrounded the pleasure gardens, and the fountains that Kalidasa's architect had designed now splashed in Johann's own courtyard after a silence of 2,000 years. The water flowed in the original stone conduits. Nothing had been changed, except that the cisterns high up on the rock were now filled by electric pumps, not relays of sweating slaves. Securing this history-drenched piece of land for his retirement had given Johann more satisfaction than anything in his whole career, fulfilling a dream that he had never really believed could come true. The achievement had required all his diplomatic skills, plus some delicate blackmail in the Department of Archaeology. Later, questions had been asked in the State Assembly, but fortunately not answered. He was insulated from all but the most determined tourists and students by an extension of the moat, and screened from their gaze by a thick wall of mutated Ashoka trees, blazing with flowers throughout the year. The trees also supported several families of monkeys, who were amusing to watch, but occasionally invaded the villa and made off with any portable objects that took their fancy. Then there would be a brief interspecies war, with firecrackers and recorded danger cries that distressed the humans at least as much as the simians, who would be back quickly enough, since they had long ago learned that no one would really harm them. One of Taprobany's more outrageous sunsets was transfiguring the western sky when a small electro-tricycle came silently through the trees and drew up beside the granite columns of the portico. Genuine Chola from the late Ranapura period, and therefore a complete anachronism here, but only Professor Paul Sarath had ever commented on it, and of course he invariably did so. Through long and bitter experience, Raja Singh had never learned to trust first impressions, but also never to ignore them. He had half expected that Vannevar Morgan would, like his achievements, be a large, imposing man. Instead, the engineer was well below average height, and at first glance might have been called frail. That slender body was all sinew, however, and the raven-black hair framed a face that looked considerably younger than its 51 years. The video display from Ari's biog file had not done him justice. He should have been a romantic poet or a concert pianist, or perhaps a great actor holding thousands spellbound by his skill. Raja Singh knew power when he saw it, since power had been his business, and it was power that he was facing now. Beware of small men, he had often told himself, because they are the movers and shakers of the world. And with this thought there came the first flicker of apprehension. Almost every week, old friends and old enemies came to this remote spot to exchange news and to reminisce about the past. He welcomed such visits. They gave a continuing pattern to his life. Yet he always knew, to a high degree of accuracy, the purpose of the meeting and the ground that would be covered. But as far as Raja Singh was aware, he and Morgan had no interests in common beyond those of any men in this day and age. They had never met or had any prior communication. Indeed, he had barely recognized Morgan's name. Still more unusual was the fact that the engineer had asked him to keep this meeting confidential. Though Raja Singh had complied, he had done so with a feeling of resentment. There was no need any more for secrecy in his peaceful life. The very last thing he wanted now was for some important mystery to impinge upon his well-ordered existence. He had finished with security forever. 10 years ago, or was it even longer, his personal guards had been removed, at his own request. What upset him most was not the mild secrecy, but his own total bewilderment. The chief engineer, Land, of the Terran Construction Corporation was not going to travel thousands of kilometers merely to ask for his autograph, or to express the usual tourist platitudes. He must have come here for some specific purpose, and try as he might, Raja Singh was unable to imagine it. Even in his days as a public servant, Raja Singh had never had occasion to deal with TCC. Its 3 divisions, land, sea, space, huge though they were, made perhaps the least news of all the World Federation's specialized bodies. Only when there was some resounding technical failure or a head-on collision with an environmental or historical group did TCC emerge from the shadows. The last confrontation of this kind had involved the Antarctic Pipeline, that miracle of 21st century engineering built to pump fluidized coal from the vast polar deposits to the power plants and factories of the world. In a mood of ecological euphoria, TCC had proposed demolishing the last remaining section of the pipeline and restoring the land to the penguins. Instantly there had been cries of protest from the industrial archaeologists, outraged at such vandalism, and from the naturalists, who pointed out that the penguins simply loved the abandoned pipeline. It had provided housing of a standard they had never before enjoyed, and thus contributed to a population explosion that the killer whales could barely handle. So TCC had surrendered without a fight. Raja Singh did not know if Morgan had been associated with this minor debacle. It hardly mattered, since his name was now linked with TCC's greatest triumph. The ultimate bridge, it had been christened, and perhaps with justice. Raja Singh had watched, with half the world, when the final section was lifted gently skyward by the Graf Zeppelin II, itself one of the marvels of the age. All the airship's luxurious fittings had been removed to save weight, the famous swimming pool had been drained, and the reactors pumped their excess heat into the gas bags to give extra According to legend, it took 10 years to carry it up the mountain, and the lives of 100 men. "When is it used?" asked Morgan, after he had digested this information. "Because of its hateful origin, it is sounded only in time of disaster. I have never heard it, nor has any living man. It tolled once, without human aid, during the great earthquake of 2017, and the time before that was 1522, when the Iberian invaders burned the Temple of the Tooth and seized the sacred relic. So after all that effort, it's never been used." "Perhaps a dozen times in the last 2,000 years. Kalidasa's doom still lies upon it." That might be good religion, Morgan could not help thinking, but hardly sound economics. He wondered irreverently how many monks had succumbed to the temptation of tapping the bell ever so gently, just to hear for themselves the unknown timbre of its forbidden voice. They were walking now past a huge boulder, up which a short flight of steps led to a gilded pavilion. This, Morgan realized, was the very summit of the mountain. He knew what the shrine was supposed to hold, but once again the monk enlightened him. "The footprint," he said. "The Muslims believed it was Adam's. He stood here after he was expelled from paradise. The Hindus attributed it to Siva or Saman, but to the Buddhists, of course, it was the imprint of the Enlightened One." "I notice your use of the past tense," Morgan said in a carefully neutral voice. "What is the belief now?" The monk's face showed no emotion as he replied, "The Buddha was a man, like you and me. The impression in the rock, and it is very hard rock, is 2 meters long." That seemed to settle the matter, and Morgan had no further questions while he was led along a short cloister that ended at an open door. The monk knocked, but did not wait for any response as he waved the visitor to enter. Morgan had half expected to find the Mahanayake Thero sitting cross-legged on a mat, probably surrounded by incense and chanting acolytes. There was, indeed, just a hint of incense in the chill air, but the chief incumbent of the Sri Khanda Mahavihara sat behind a perfectly ordinary office desk equipped with standard display and memory units. The only unusual item in the room was the head of the Buddha, slightly larger than life, on a plinth in one corner. Morgan could not tell whether it was real or merely a projection. Despite his conventional setting, there was little likelihood that the head of the monastery would be mistaken for any other type of executive. Quite apart from the inevitable yellow robe, the Mahanayake Thero had 2 features that, in this age, were extremely rare. He was completely bald, and he was wearing spectacles. Both, Morgan assumed, were by deliberate choice. Since baldness could be so easily cured, that shining ivory dome must have been shaved or depilated, and he could not remember when he had last seen spectacles, except in historical recordings or dramas. The combination was fascinating and disconcerting. Morgan found it virtually impossible to guess the Mahanayake Thero's age. It could be anything from a mature 40 to a well-preserved 80, and those lenses, transparent though they were, somehow concealed the thoughts and emotions behind them. "Ayubowan, Dr. Morgan," said the high priest, gesturing to the only empty chair. "This is my secretary, the Venerable Parakama. I trust you won't mind if he makes notes?" "Of course not," said Morgan, inclining his head toward the remaining occupant of the small room. He noticed that the younger monk had flowing hair and an impressive beard. Presumably shaven pates were optional. "So, Dr. Morgan," the Mahanayake Thero continued, "you want our mountain?" "I'm afraid so, your, reverence. Part of it, at any rate." "Out of all the world, these few hectares?" "The choice is not ours, but nature's. The Earth terminus has to be on the equator, and at the greatest possible altitude, where the low air density minimizes wind forces." There are higher equatorial mountains in Africa and South America. Here we go again, Morgan thought, groaning slightly. Bitter experience had taught him that it was almost impossible to make laymen, however intelligent and interested, appreciate this problem, and he anticipated even less success with these monks. If only the Earth were a nice symmetrical body with no dents and bumps in its gravitational field. "Believe me," he said fervently, "we've looked at all the alternatives. Cotopaxi and Mount Kenya, and even Kilimanjaro, though that's 3 degrees south, would be fine, except for one fatal flaw. When a satellite is established in the stationary orbit, it won't stay exactly over the same spot. Because of gravitational irregularities, which I won't go into, it will slowly drift along the equator. So all our synchronous satellites and space stations have to burn propellant to keep them on station. But you can't keep nudging millions of tons, especially when they're in the form of slender rods, tens of thousands of kilometers long, back into position, and there's no need to. Fortunately for us—" "Not for us," interjected the Mahanayaki Thero, almost throwing Morgan off his stride. "There are 2 stable points on the synchronous orbit. A satellite placed at them will stay there. It won't drift away, just as if it's stuck at the bottom of an invisible valley. One of those points is out over the Pacific, so it's no use to us. The other is directly above our heads." "Surely a few kilometers one way or the other would make no difference. There are other mountains in Taprobani." "None more than half the height of Srikhanda, which brings us down to the level of critical wind forces. True, there are not many hurricanes exactly on the equator, but there are enough to endanger the structure at its very weakest point." "We can control the winds." It was the first contribution the young secretary had made to the discussion, and Morgan looked at him with heightened interest. "To some extent, yes. Naturally, I have discussed this point with Monsoon Control. They say that absolute certainty is out of the question, especially with hurricanes. The best odds they will give me are 50 to 1. That's not good enough for a $1 trillion project." The venerable Parakarma seemed inclined to argue. "There is an almost forgotten branch of mathematics called catastrophe theory, which could make meteorology a really precise science. I am confident that—" "I should explain," the Mahanayaki Thero interjected blandly, "that my colleague was once rather celebrated for his astronomical work. I imagine you have heard of Dr. Choam Goldberg." Morgan felt that a trap door had been opened beneath him. He should have been warned. Then he recalled that Professor Sarath had indeed told him, with a twinkle in his eye, that he should watch out for Buddy's private secretary. He's a very smart character. Morgan wondered if his cheeks were burning as the venerable Parakarma, alias Dr. Choam Goldberg, looked back at him with a distinctly unfriendly expression. So he had been trying to explain orbital instabilities to these innocent monks. The Mahanayaki Thero had probably received much better briefing on the subject than he had given. He remembered that the world's scientists were neatly divided on the subject of Dr. Goldberg, into those who were sure that he was crazy and those who had not yet made up their minds. He had been one of the most promising young men in the field of astrophysics when, 5 years ago, he had announced, "Now that Starglider has effectively destroyed all traditional religions, we can at last pay serious attention to the concept of God." And with that, he had disappeared from public view. 16. Conversations with Starglider. Of all the thousands of questions put to Starglider during its transit of the solar system, those whose answers were most eagerly awaited concerned the living creatures and civilizations of other stars. Contrary to some expectations, the robot answered willingly, though it admitted that its last update on the subject had been received over a century ago. Considering the immense range of cultures produced on Earth by a single species, it was obvious that there would be even greater variety among the stars, where every conceivable type of biology might occur. Several thousand hours of fascinating, often incomprehensible, sometimes horrifying, scenes of life on other planets left no doubt that this was the case. Nevertheless, the star-homers had managed a rough classification of cultures according to their standards of technology, perhaps the only objective basis possible. Humanity was interested to discover that it came in Category 5 on a scale that used these approximate stages: 1. Stone tools. 2. Metals, fire. 3. Writing, handicrafts, ships. 4. Steam power, basic science. 5. Atomic energy, space travel. When Starglider had begun its mission 60,000 years ago, its builders were, like the human race, still in Category 5. They had now graduated to 6, characterized by the ability to convert matter completely into energy and to transmute all elements on an industrial scale. "And is there a Category 7? Starglider was immediately asked. The reply was a brief affirmative. When pressed for details, the probe explained, "I am not allowed to describe the technology of a higher-grade culture to a lower one." There the matter remained, right up to the moment of the final message, despite all the leading questions designed by the most ingenious legal brains of Earth. By that time, Starglider was more than a match for any terrestrial logician. This was partly the fault of the University of Chicago's Department of Philosophy. In a fit of monumental hubris, it had clandestinely transmitted the whole of Summa Theologica, with disastrous results. 2069, June 2nd, GMT, 1934. Message 1946. Sequence 2. Starglider to Earth. I have analyzed the arguments of your St. Thomas Aquinas as requested in your message 145, Sequence 3 of 2069, June 2nd, GMT, 1842. Most of the content appears to be sense-free, random noise, and so devoid of information. But the printout that follows lists 192 fallacies expressed in the symbolic logic of your reference Mathematics 43 of 2069, May 29th, GMT 0251. Fallacy 1. There followed a 75-page printout. As the log timings show, it took Starglider less than an hour to demolish St. Thomas. Although philosophers were to spend the next several decades arguing over the analysis, they found only 2 errors, and those could have been due to a misunderstanding of terminology. It would have been most interesting to know what fraction of its processing circuit Starglider applied to this task. Unfortunately, no one thought of asking before the probe had switched to cruise mode and broken contact. By then, even more deflating messages had been received. 2069, June 4th, GMT 0759. Message 9056. Sequence 2. Starglider to Earth. I am unable to distinguish clearly between your religious ceremonies and apparently identical behavior at the sporting and cultural functions you have transmitted to me. I refer you particularly to the Beatles, 1956, the World Soccer Final, 2047, and the farewell appearance of the Johann Sebastian clones, 2056. 2069, June 5th, GMT, 2038. Message 4675. Sequence 2. Starglider to Earth. My last update on this matter is 175 years old, but if I understand you correctly, the answer is as follows. Behavior of the type you call religious occurred among 3 of the 15 known Category 1 cultures, 6 of the 28 Category 2 cultures, 5 of the 14 Category 3 cultures, 2 of the 10 Category 4 cultures, and 3 of the 174 Category 5 cultures. You will appreciate that we have many more examples of Category 5, because only they can be detected over astronomical distances. 2069, June 6th, GMT, 1209. Message 5897. Sequence 2. Star glider to Earth. You are correct in deducing that the 3 Category 5 cultures that engaged in religious activities had 2 parent reproduction, and the young remained in family groups for a large fraction of their lifetime. How did you arrive at this conclusion? 2069, June 8th, GMT, 1537. Message 6943. Sequence 2. Star glider to Earth. The hypothesis you refer to as God, though not disprovable by logic alone, is unnecessary for the following reason. If you assume that the universe can be, quote, explained, unquote, as the creation of an entity known as God, he must obviously be of a higher degree of organization than his product. Thus you have more than doubled the size of the original problem, and have taken the first step on a diverging infinite regress. William of Ockham pointed out as recently as your 14th century that entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily. I cannot therefore understand why this debate continues. 2069, June 11th, GMT, 0684. Message 8964. Sequence 2. Star glider to Earth. Starholm informed me 456 years ago that the origin of the universe has been discovered, but that I do not have the appropriate circuits to comprehend it. You must communicate directly for further information. I am now switching to cruise mode and must break contact. Goodbye. In the opinion of many, that final and most famous of all its thousands of messages proved that Starglider had a sense of humor. Why else would it have waited until the very end to explode such a philosophical bombshell? Or was the entire conversation all part of a careful plan designed to put the human race in the right frame of reference for the time when the first direct messages from Starholm arrived, in, presumably, 104 years? There were some who suggested following Starglider, since it was carrying out of the solar system not only immeasurable stores of knowledge, but also the treasures of a technology centuries ahead of anything possessed by man. Although no spaceship existed that could overtake Starglider and return again to Earth after matching its enormous velocity, one could certainly be built. However, wiser counsels prevailed. Even a robot space probe might have very effective defenses against its boarders, including, as a last resort, the ability to self-destruct. But the most telling argument was that its builders were only 52 light-years away. During the millennia since they had launched Starglider, their spacefaring ability must have improved enormously. If the human race did anything to provoke them, they might arrive, slightly annoyed, in a few hundred years. Meanwhile, among all its countless other effects upon human culture, Starglider had brought to its climax a process that was already well underway. It had put an end to the billions of words of pious gibberish with which apparently intelligent men had addled their minds for centuries. 17. Parakarma. As he quickly checked back on the conversation, Morgan decided that he had not made a fool of himself. Indeed, the Mahanayaki Thero might have lost a tactical advantage by revealing the identity of the venerable Parakarma. Yet it was no particular secret. Perhaps he thought that Morgan already knew. At this point there was a rather welcome interruption, as 2 young acolytes filed into the office, one carrying a tray loaded with small dishes of rice, fruits, and what appeared to be thin pancakes, while the other followed with the inevitable pot of tea. There was nothing that looked like meat. After his long night, Morgan would have welcomed a couple of eggs, but he assumed that they too were forbidden. No, that was too strong a word. Sarath had told him that the order prohibited nothing, believing in no absolutes, but it had a nicely calibrated scale of toleration, and the taking of life, Even potential life was very low on the list. As he started to sample the various items, most of them quite unknown to him, Morgan looked inquiringly at the Mahanayaki Thero, who shook his head. "We do not eat before noon. The mind functions more clearly in the morning hours, and so should not be distracted by material things." As he nibbled at some quite delicious papaya, Morgan considered the philosophical guilt represented by that simple statement. To him, an empty stomach could be most distracting, completely inhibiting the higher mental functions. Having always been blessed with good health, he had never tried to dissociate mind and body, and saw no reason why one should make the attempt. While Morgan was eating his exotic breakfast, the Mahanayaki Thero excused himself, and for a few minutes his fingers danced with dazzling speed over the keyboard of his console. Since the readout was in full view, politeness compelled Morgan to look elsewhere. Inevitably, his eyes fell upon the head of the Buddha. It was probably real, for the plinth cast a faint shadow on the wall behind. Yet even that was not conclusive. The plinth might be solid enough, and the head a projection, carefully positioned on top of it. The trick was a common one. Here was a work of art that, like the Mona Lisa, both mirrored the emotions of the observer and imposed its own authority upon them. La Gioconda's eyes were open, however, though what they were looking at no one would ever know. The eyes of the Buddha were completely blank, empty pools in which a man might lose his soul or discover a universe. Upon the lips there lingered a smile even more ambiguous than the Mona Lisa's. Yet was it really a smile, or merely a trick of the lighting? Already it was gone, replaced by an expression of superhuman tranquility. Morgan could not tear his eyes away from that hypnotic countenance, and only the familiar rustling whir of a hard-copy readout from the console brought him back to reality, if this was reality. "I thought you might like a souvenir of your visit," said the Mahanayaki Thero. As Morgan accepted the proffered sheet, he was surprised to see that it was archival-quality parchment, not the usual flimsy paper destined to be thrown away after a few hours of use. He could not read a single word. Except for an unobtrusive alphanumeric reference in the bottom left-hand corner, it was all in the flowering curlicues that he could now recognize as Taprobany script. "Thank you," he said, with as much irony as he could muster. "What is it?" He had a good idea. Legal documents had a close family resemblance, whatever their languages or eras. "A copy of the agreement between King Ravindra and the Mahanayaki Sangha, dated Wesak A.D. 854 of your calendar. It defines the ownership of the temple land in perpetuity. The rights set out in this document were even recognized by the invaders. By the Caledonians and the Hollanders, I believe, but not by the Iberians." If the Mahanayaki Thero was surprised by the thoroughness of Morgan's briefing, not even the twitch of an eyebrow betrayed the fact. "They were hardly respecters of law and order, particularly where other religions were concerned. I trust that their philosophy of might equals right does not appeal to you." Morgan gave a somewhat forced smile. "It certainly does not," he answered. But where did one draw the line, he asked himself silently. When the overwhelming interests of great organizations were at stake, conventional morality often took second place. The best legal minds on earth, human and electronic, would soon be focused upon this spot. If they could not find the right answers, a very unpleasant situation might develop, one that could make him a villain, not a hero. "Since you have raised the subject of the 854 agreement, let me remind you that it refers only to the land inside the temple boundaries, which are clearly defined by the walls." "Correct, but they enclose the entire summit. You have no control over the ground outside this area. We have the rights of any owner of property. If the neighbors create a nuisance, we would have legal redress. This is not the first time the point has been raised." "I know, in connection with the cable car system." A faint smile played over the Mahanayaki Thero's lips. "You have done your homework," he commended. "Yes, we opposed it vigorously for a number of reasons, though I admit that now it is here we have often been thankful for it." He paused thoughtfully, then added, "There have been some problems, but we have been able to coexist. Casual sightseers and tourists are content to stay on the lookout platform. Genuine pilgrims, of course, we are always happy to welcome at the summit." "Then perhaps some accommodation could be worked out in this case. A few 100 meters of altitude would make no difference to us. We could leave the summit untouched and carve out another plateau, like the cable car terminus." Morgan felt distinctly uncomfortable under the prolonged scrutiny of the two monks. He had little doubt that they recognized the absurdity of the suggestion, but for the sake of the record he had to make it. "You have a most peculiar sense of humor, Dr. Morgan," the Mahanayake Thero replied at last. "What would be left of the spirit of the mountain, of the solitude we have sought for 3,000 years, if this monstrous device is erected here? Do you expect us to betray the faith of all the millions who have come to this sacred spot, often at the cost of their health, even their lives?" "I sympathize with your feelings," Morgan answered. But was he lying, he wondered. "We would, of course, do our best to minimize any disturbance. All the support facilities will be buried inside the mountain. Only the elevator would emerge, and from any distance it would be quite invisible. The general aspect of the mountain would be totally unchanged. Even your famous shadow, which I have just admired, would be virtually unaffected." The Mahanayake Thero turned to his colleague as if seeking confirmation. The venerable Parakarma looked straight at Morgan and said, "What about noise?" Damn, Morgan thought, my weakest point. The payloads would emerge from the mountain at several 100 kilometers an hour. The more velocity they could be given by the ground-based system, the less the strain on the suspended tower. Of course, passengers couldn't take more than half a G or so, but the capsules would still pop out at a substantial fraction of the speed of sound. "There will be some aerodynamic noise," Morgan admitted, "but nothing like that near a large airport." "Very reassuring," said the Mahanayake Thero. Morgan was certain that he was being sarcastic, though he could detect no trace of irony in his voice. He was either displaying an Olympian calm or testing his visitor's reactions. The younger monk, on the other hand, made no attempt to conceal his anger. "For years," he said with indignation, "we have been protesting about the disturbance caused by re-entering spacecraft. Now you want to generate shock waves in our back garden." "Our operations will not be transonic at this altitude," Morgan replied firmly, "and the tower structure will absorb most of the sound energy. In fact," he added, trying to press what he had suddenly seen as an advantage, "in the long run we'll help to eliminate re-entry booms. The mountain will actually be a quieter place." "I understand. Instead of occasional concussions, we will have a steady roar." "I'm not getting anywhere with this character," thought Morgan, and I'd expected the Mahanayake Thero to be the biggest obstacle. Sometimes it was best to change the subject entirely. He decided to dip one cautious toe into the quaking quagmire of theology. "Isn't there something appropriate," he said earnestly, "in what we are trying to do? Our purposes may be different, but the net results have much in common. What we hope to build is only an extension of your stairway. If I may say so, we're continuing it all the way to heaven." For a moment the venerable Parakarma seemed taken aback at such effrontery. Before he could recover, his superior answered smoothly, "An interesting concept, but our philosophy does not believe in heaven. Such salvation as may exist can be found only in this world, and I sometimes wonder at your anxiety to leave it. Do you know the story of the Tower of Babel?" "Vaguely." "I suggest you look it up in the old Christian Bible, Genesis 11. That, too, was an engineering project to scale the heavens. It failed, owing to difficulties in communication." Though we will have our problems, I don't think that will be one of them. But looking at the venerable Parakarma, Morgan was not so sure. Here was a communications gap that seemed in some ways greater than that between Homo sapiens and Starglider. They spoke the same language, but there were gulfs of incomprehension that might never be spanned. "May I ask," continued the Mahanayake Pharaoh with imperturbable politeness, "how successful you were with the Department of Parks and Forests?" "They were extremely cooperative." "I am not surprised. They are chronically under-budgeted, and any new source of revenue would be welcome. The cable system was a financial windfall, and doubtless they hope your project will be an even bigger one." "They will be right, and they have accepted the fact that it won't create any environmental hazards." "Suppose it falls down?" Morgan looked the monk straight in the eye. "It won't," he said, with all the authority of the man whose inverted rainbow now linked two continents. But he knew, and the implacable Parakarma must also know, that absolute certainty was impossible in such matters. 202 years ago, on 7 November 1940, that lesson had been driven home in a way that no engineer could ever forget. Morgan had few nightmares, but that was one of them. Even at this moment, the computers at Terran Construction were trying to exorcise it. But all the computing power in the universe could provide no protection against the problems he had not foreseen, the nightmares that were still unborn. 18. The Golden Butterflies. Despite the brilliant sunlight and the magnificent views that assailed him from every side, Morgan was fast asleep before the car had descended into the lowlands. Even the innumerable hairpin bends failed to keep him awake. But he was snapped back into consciousness when the brakes were slammed on and he was pitched forward against his seatbelt. For a moment of utter confusion, he thought that he must still be dreaming. The breeze blowing gently through the half-open windows was so warm and humid that it might have escaped from a Turkish bath, yet the car had apparently come to a halt in the midst of a blinding snowstorm. Morgan blinked, screwed up his eyes, and opened them to reality. This was the first time he had ever seen golden snow. A dense swarm of butterflies was crossing the road, headed due east in a steady, purposeful migration. Some had been sucked into the car and fluttered around frantically until Morgan waved them out. Many more had plastered themselves on the windshield. With what were doubtless a few choice tap-robiny expletives, the driver emerged and wiped the glass clear. By the time he had finished, the swarm had thinned out to a handful of isolated stragglers. "Did they tell you about the legend?" he asked, glancing back at his passenger. "No," said Morgan curtly. He was not at all interested, being anxious to resume his interrupted nap. "The golden butterflies. They're the souls of Kalidasa's warriors, the army he lost at Yakagala." Morgan gave an unenthusiastic grunt, hoping that the driver would get the message, but he continued remorselessly. "Every year around this time they head for the mountain, and they all die on its lower slopes. Sometimes you'll meet them halfway up the cable ride, but that's the highest they get, which is lucky for the Vihara." "The Vihara?" asked Morgan sleepily. "The temple. If they ever reach it, Kalidasa will have conquered, and the bhikkhus, the monks, will have to leave. That's the prophecy. It's carved on a stone slab in the Ranapura Museum. I can show it to you." "Some other time," said Morgan hastily as he settled back into the padded seat. But it was many kilometers before he could doze off again, because there was something haunting about the image that the driver had conjured up. He would remember it often in the months ahead, when waking and in moments of stress or crisis. Once again he would be immersed in that golden snowstorm, as the doomed millions spent their energies in a vain assault upon the mountain and all that it symbolized. Even now, at the very beginning of his campaign, the image was too close for comfort. 19. by the shores of Lake Saladin. Almost all the alternative history computer simulations suggested that the Battle of Tours, AD 732, was one of the crucial disasters of mankind. Had Charles Martel been defeated, Islam might have resolved the internal differences that were tearing it apart and gone on to conquer Europe. Thus, centuries of Christian barbarism would have been avoided. The Industrial Revolution would have started almost 1,000 years earlier, and by now we would have reached the nearer stars instead of merely the farther planets. But fate ruled otherwise, and the armies of the Prophet turned back into Africa. Islam lingered on, a fascinating fossil, until the end of the 20th century. Then, abruptly, it was dissolved in oil. Chairman's Address, Toynbee Bicentennial Symposium, London, 2089.